we are starting into our next paper. I am very pleased to introduce Julia Engelschalt. She holds an BA in English and Social Sciences from Humboldt University in Berlin and a master's degree in History, Philosophy, and Sociology of Science from Bielefeld University. She currently works in our CRC 1288, and as you maybe remember from yesterday, she is a doctoral researcher in our project A03 that I'm leading with Angelika Epple. So Julia is my PhD student, and she is going to present part of her dissertation project now. I think we will learn about her subject right now in her talk, and she told me this morning that her title changed slightly, and it's Climate Contagion and American Empire Comparative Practices in US Colonial Medicine from 1898 to 1910. And we're looking forward. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eleonora, for your kind introduction. Thanks also to the entire organizing committee for having me. Am I loud enough? Okay, awesome. And also thank you all for coming out this early and apparently staying healthy, which in Bielefeld's subtropical conditions isn't always easy. I know what I'm talking about because, so apologies in advance for any sneezing or coughing on my part. You know, along with my topic, I've brought my own bacteria. What I will be presenting today is very much work in progress, and I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions afterwards, particularly after yesterday's presentations. I feel like there are a lot of points that my presentation also speaks to. In the next half hour, I would like to zoom in on the medical side of US-American colonial expansion in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War of 1898. As a result of that war, the United States joined the ranks of imperial powers with its acquisition of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a little later in 1903, the Panama Canal Zone. In doing so, the self-proclaimed American mission was to civilize the local populations and, in President McKinley's terminology, benevolently assimilate them into what proponents of the American imperial venture envisioned as a more modern version of empire than that established by their Spanish predecessors. American medical and sanitary officers were at the forefront of this mission of spreading uplift and progress. After all, as historian Bobby Wintemute has pointed out, their importance was based on not only their, but also others' assumption that, quote unquote, American civic and scientific know-how would provide the inhabitants of these tropic locales the basic requirements, health, education, and sanitation necessary for political and commercial development, unquote. However, the establishment of public health infrastructures in the colonies came with another, even more immediate challenge to American medical officers. They had to make sure that the colonizers themselves remained healthy in the new American tropics. Despite the fact that laboratory medicine had largely disproved the assumption that climatic conditions were a distinct or direct cause of infectious disease, uncertainty prevailed when it came to assessing the more general impact of heat, humidity, and solar radiation close to the equator on the bodies of white people. Thus, can white people permanently live and thrive in the tropics pretty much sums up one of the major issues debated by medical personnel across the American overseas territories during the first decade of the 20th century. And while I am very well aware that local colonized medical elites significantly contributed to that debate, my focus today will be on the American and yes, predominantly white and predominantly male side of that discourse. In and of itself, the debate over the potentially unhealthy character of tropical environments was anything but new. When the United States expanded into the tropics, they were drawing on a long-standing European discourse that David Arnold, in close analogy to Edward Said's notion of Orientalism, has called tropicality. Over the 19th century, this highly ambivalent notion of the tropical environment as a lush, idyllic paradise on the one hand and a repository of insalubrious conditions and disease on the other had taken on additional aspects of civilizational and racial determinism, including such questions as whether people from the temperate zone could acclimate to the tropics, and how much civilizational progress was determined by climatic circumstances. Using Arnold's own definition, the tropics existed only in mental juxtaposition to something else, the perceived normality of the temperate lands. Tropicality was the experience of northern whites moving into an alien world, alien in climate, vegetation, people, and disease. This description resonates with many of the writings produced by American medical officers in the tropics. Fear and triumphalism in the face of such climatic otherness frequently occur together in reports and scientific articles, which at this point constitute the main part of my source corpus. However, there is also an argument to be made for historical specificity and Americanness in the context of tropicality. After all, the United States itself had a long-standing tradition shaped very much by its internal westward expansion of medically motivated climate observation. Furthermore, as J.R. McNeill has shown in his seminal book Mosquito Empires, epidemic disease and regional climatic differences had a vital impact, or perhaps more appropriately a lethal one, on the course of US history. By consequence, earlier developments in American public health and sanitation practices had a lot to do with that same history of regionally specific etiologies of infectious disease. Falling into the early years of the American Progressive Era, American medical interactions with the tropics were shaped by a perceived need to gather scientifically valid knowledge on the real impact of climate on the human body in order to determine strategies for public health, not only in the tropics, but eventually also back home. Some scholars, including Warwick Anderson, Natalie J. Ring, and Paul Sutter, have suggested that the managerial interventionist approach to public health, which developed in the United States over the first 2 decades of the 20th century, can at least partly be explained as a result of colonial medical and sanitary practices. And my contribution to this debate, as might hardly surprise anyone here, is that in order to analyze that link and to make it evident, it helps to look at the role of comparative practices in this particular context. For today, I've decided to highlight 3 aspects of what American colonial medical officers did when they compared. And these 3 points also form the outline of my presentation. And the first point, establishing the tropical other, basically goes back to what I said earlier about tropicality as a normalizing Western imperial discourse in which the tropics are constructed as a dangerous, yet rather unspecific climatic and cultural space. However, very early on in their colonial involvement, medical officers also began to acknowledge climatic and epidemiological differences between the different parts of the tropical empire. For the time being, I'd like to call this part acknowledging distinctions. And finally, while fears of climatic risks continued to linger in medical discourse well into the 20th century, there also was a growing sense that the tropics might not be that different after all, particularly in comparison to the southern United States. And that's kind of the idea behind the third part, accepting similarity. My source examples, I hope, will show that this categorization does not necessarily imply a chronological order or a sort of progressing process of accumulating knowledge about the tropics, and that one idea was necessarily erased by the other over the course of time. Nor does one author necessarily stick to either of these 3 sort of comparative practices that I've outlined here. Rather, I use these 3 aspects as a way of approaching my material based on what I, initially read in those writings. So, after a little break, let's take a look at what the other, through an American lens, looked like. From the outset, the tropical world challenged the practical and scientific knowledge sanitarians and medical practitioners had gathered over the decades prior to the Spanish-American War. In the following quote by Major Azel Ames, a brigade surgeon in the US Volunteers who had served in Puerto Rico during wartime, the threat of disease is intimately linked not only with a baffling pattern of contagion, but also with the more general topic of civilization. For the first time in the cognizance of American sanitary officers, the spectacle was presented of the non-populous regions feeding the disease to the cities and towns. A condition of things which, it will readily be seen, greatly increased the difficulty of control, where, as in the United States, the usual primary centers of the contagion are a few large cities or manufacturing towns, the task of restricting it is obviously much easier, and its spread is much less rapid than when a score or two of small and scattered communities without sanitary regulation are sending it daily to the market towns and cities about them. Although this excerpt is part of a report on the success of a comprehensive smallpox vaccination campaign in Puerto Rico, we get the sense that the world is somehow turned upside down in this tropical part of the world, where not urban congestion, but rural, largely natural spaces and their inhabitants are depicted as actively sending disease, thereby sabotaging health conditions in larger cities. American sanitarians, thus the basic message, are dealing with a whole set of differences with an environment and people they perceive as far less medically civilized than their home country, defeating the means of control they commonly exert in cases of epidemics in the United States. Particularly in the early years of American colonialism, sanitary and civilizational triumphalism were routinely counterbalanced with white tropical anxieties. The two of them together, as has been convincingly argued by Warwick Anderson, Bobby Wintermute, and others, colluded in the process of validating white, predominantly male Americanness. The tropics, as frequently as they are mentioned by medical and sanitary officers, are rarely specified or complemented with an explicit comparative counterpart. They're hot, they're humid, and while they may or may not be directly responsible for disease contagion, over time many medical officers agreed that they weren't, they were still dangerous to live in for white people, and that was that. Let me show you one more example of what we might call a more or less implicit generalized comparison of this kind. The same army surgeon, Major Azel Ames, in 1902 published a volume entitled Elementary Hygiene for the Tropics. At first glance, this little book looks like any other hygiene manual. It's a very popular genre among proponents of the new domestic science movement in the United States. And the preface kind of seems to point into that direction, because it says, to help teach the young what must be done and what must not, so as to have health and the good things that health brings, is the purpose of this little book. A little further down, we learn where the author sees the connection between hygiene and the tropics. As in hot climates, there are many things which cause sickness that are not found in colder countries. The first or elementary things of hygiene in the tropics call for such special thought and study as are given in these pages. Now, it would be misleading to think that we're actually dealing with a book for people living in the tropics or planning on doing so in the future. It starts out with the main tenet that everyone is responsible for their own individual health and the healthiness of their homes. And that home, as becomes clear after reading the very first pages, actually, is assumed to be located in the temperate zone. The tropics, in the above quote, as well as throughout the manual, are out there somewhere, a climatic bogeyman reminding the reader of the potential costs of unhealthy habits. Basically, the tropics serve as a generalized medical horror image in the effort to drive home a larger pedagogical lesson on hygienic behavior. The illustrations further underline this rhetoric. Page 19 of this manual, for instance, features a photographic image. I hope you can see it, actually. It's a very bad quality, but I did not scan this book. I did not digitize it. A photographic image of a few simple huts and a palm tree, left-hand side, which I personally found pretty inconspicuous until I read the caption, which says, it's down there, a crowded cluster of unhealthy homes. Following the image credit given by Ames himself to an 1899 edition of Harper's Weekly, I found the same picture illustrating an article in the Our New Possessions series on the situation of the Puerto Rican peasantry. The original caption, this is Harper's Weekly, is actually quite informative, and it even names the place of origin of this photograph, a primitive peon village outskirts of Caguas. The Harper's Weekly article itself does mention the prevalence of certain epidemic diseases among the peasant population of Puerto Rico, so it makes sense that Ames, who had served there, would have read the piece with personal as well as professional medical interest. However, by presenting the image outside of its original context and with a very different caption, he turns the picturesque peasant village about 20 miles south of San Jose, I looked it up, if you want to know, into an anonymous, frightening diseasescape, which could be located in any of the American tropical possessions. Sweeping generalizations of this kind definitely were not the only way in which Americans conceptualized their island empire, to borrow the title of an 1899 handbook on the topic. In fact, the case of Puerto Rico is particularly interesting because a great number of medical officers actually praised the unexpectedly positive influence of local climatic conditions on American troops. The success of the anti-smallpox campaign might have had something to do with that, as might the fact that from an American perspective, the Puerto Ricans were actually very welcoming to the American liberators from Spanish rule. Still, the idea that tropical climates generally had to be encountered with caution often appears abstract and disconnected from such specific circumstances and locales in many medical writings of the period. But the story doesn't end there, and that's where I'd like to move on to the part I've captioned acknowledging distinctions. Right from the beginning of American expansion into the tropics, medical officers were eager to gather data, to assemble statistics on disease, mortality, and fatality in different places and weigh their findings from different parts of the colonial empire against each other. To illustrate that simultaneity of positions, I'd like to introduce an example that was published at around the same time as the writings by Azel Ames, from which I quoted earlier. In 1903, U.S. Army Major Dr. Charles Francis Mason published an article entitled Notes from the Experiences of a Medical Officer in the Tropics in the Journal of Military Surgeons of the United States. Mason had served as a surgeon in Puerto Rico for 9 months, followed by a 17-month service period in Panay in the Philippine archipelago. The article, which is based largely on Mason's earlier report to the Surgeon General U.S. Army from November of 1900, begins with an interesting terminological distinction. He says, I use the term diseases in the tropics instead of tropical diseases because there are few, if any, tropical diseases. That is to say, diseases which occur only in the tropics. And the relative prevalence of particular diseases is very different from that obtaining in temperate climates. In other words, Mason does not necessarily deny the basic assumption of tropical medicine that the tropics and the temperate zones are epidemiologically different, but rather he conceptualizes that difference not as categorical, but as comparative and relative in nature. A little further down, it becomes obvious that this comparative distinction does not only apply to different climate zones, but also to different places that are regarded as belonging to the same zone. Note how he elaborates on how he was, and I quote here, struck with the relative infrequency here, that's in Panay, the Philippines, of certain diseases common in Puerto Rico, while certain other diseases often met with here were of rare occurrence there. He even illustrates this point with the help of a chart, which I hope you can at least, I hope you can guess what it says, which compares the occurrence of several diseases in the two islands. So on the left-hand side, you have the diseases. If you want to know, it's a nice topic in the morning, filariasis and ankylostomiasis, and yes, I've always wanted to say these words in public, are parasitical worm infections. Chiggers is something similar. Syphilis, I think we all know, malarial fevers and the other fevers. And then there are two malnutrition diseases, pyemia and beriberi. The chart categorizes local prevalence in very general terms, such as common, rare, not rare, uncommon, and rare or absent, while also distinguishing between two types of population, that's occupying troops and the locals, both for the cases of Puerto Rico and Panay. To complicate matters further, Mason acknowledges that these observations were made during wartime, and he elaborates on how certain diseases, particularly syphilis, were differently distributed once Panay had been pacified, while his, quote, experience with malarial fever was unchanged, unquote. In Mason's account, the prevalence of diseases in the tropics is thus anything but regionally or temporally stable or fixed, but it very much depends on a variety of other influencing factors. Among them, and this is where the author does generalize from his very specific findings, the climate is pretty much the only one that cannot be changed by common preventive measures or by avoiding, as he puts it, errors of diet, abuse of alcoholics, chilling after overheating, and the like. And importantly, climatic influences too, in Mason's view, had to be carefully assessed over a longer period of time and for individual diseases. For instance, quote, dysentery, we're talking about diarrhea here, prevails throughout the year, but there is a marked increase in the number and severity of the cases at the commencement of the rainy season, and a progressive increase in both respects until a maximum is reached toward the end of August. Interestingly and puzzlingly, Mason's elaborate comparative work on the epidemiological differences between Puerto Rico and Panay does not lead to a positive answer to the fundamental question of whether white people can subsist in the tropics for an extended period of time. While claiming that by following certain rules, most diseases in the tropics are in fact preventable, Mason still exists that, and I directly quote from his article, "In my opinion, there is no such thing as acclimation." And he further says that soldiers should not be kept in the tropics for more than 2 years, or 3 years, and 2 would be better. The accumulation of nuanced empirical data apparently did not go all the way in erasing general fears of long-term white degeneration. What it did do was to provide evidence and give scientific credibility to medical practitioners and sanitarians as they were trying to establish generally applicable practical rules of disease prevention and individual hygienic behavior for American soldiers across the tropical colonies. Moving on to the last part, look at the watch, at the clock. The perceived need to find effective strategies of disease control and, above all, prevention did not apply exclusively to the tropical colonies. Within the United States, the institutionalization of municipal and state public health boards had made headway in the post-Civil War period, and particularly in the aftermath of the Mississippi Valley yellow fever epidemic of 1878. The American venture into the tropics was accompanied by what initially seemed like unique health risks and sanitary challenges for white troops and local populations. Yet very quickly we can observe a growing sense among medical professionals and influential political actors, notably, that the experimental tropical laboratories offered insights which could also benefit domestic public health policies and practices. In order for that to happen, however, the tropical other, the risky other, had to be made to look slightly more familiar and less terrifying. In 1902, the Committee on the Philippines of the US Senate conducted a hearing on the state of affairs in the Philippine Islands. And one of the interviewees was William Howard Taft, then governor of the Philippines. And among other topics, he was questioned on the healthfulness of the archipelago. Though not technically a medical professional, he does refer in these hearings to medical statistics that he has assembled as in the position of governor. And what he has to say is that the great trouble that Americans and Europeans meet is the continued high temperature. But that temperature, except in April, May, and the early part of June, is never as high as it is in summer in Washington or Cincinnati or St. Louis. And this passage is interesting because Taft, at least during those early years, is often regarded as having been an opponent of long-term white settlement in the tropics. Elsewhere in the hearing minutes, he does indeed support the 2-year period allotted by many medical officers before the onset of degenerative climatic effects. But, and this is a point he emphatically repeats in 2 consecutive sessions of his hearing, quote, "The health of the troops when not engaged in hiking, that is, when not engaged in exposing themselves to rough weather and continued marches, is about as good as it is in the southern," and he means the United States. The problem in comparing the health of troops in the Philippines with those at home, according to Taft, was that the same conditions did not apply in both circumstances because troops were more safely garrisoned in mainland camps than in the Philippines. The message is clear. Hypothetically speaking, if the same external conditions could be established in both locales, the tropics, at least for a short period of exposure, would have to be regarded as being very similar to, and thus no more threatening than, the familiar American southern states. To conclude, as I hope to have demonstrated during the War of 1898 and in the early years of American colonial ventures in the tropics, medical discourse was not, or at least not entirely, a mere reflection of jingoistic triumphalism. Climatic fears of white degeneration were frequently voiced by medical officers, certainly not without the intent to legitimize their status as much-needed agents of empire. At the same time, right from the beginning of their involvement in the medical colonial project, those professionals actively assembled data and compared their findings with from various tropical locales in order to develop practical solutions which would be generalizable across colonies. One of the outcomes of those efforts, the successful sanitation campaign surrounding the construction of the Panama Canal, was celebrated in medical and public health discourses from the 1910s onwards, and repeatedly cited as an example, as a victory over the unruliness of tropical climate and nature. In 1912, oh, sorry, that's not it. Actually, I wanted to show you one more quote. I'll be real quick about this. So in 1912, William Howard Taft, by then President of the United States, opened the 15th International Congress on Hygiene and Demography in Washington, D.C., with an address in which the American colonies appeared to have lost their threatening aspect altogether, and the otherness of tropical nature is being reduced to a mere matter of scale. And he says, "In the tropics, nature has a more rapid growth, not only in vegetation and in animal life, but the diseases are shown on a larger scale and permit the study of their development with more certainty of conclusion than in the temperate zone." According to the speaker, medical and public health work in the tropics had established for a fact that white settlement was indeed a possibility. In addition to that, he praises the ongoing sanitary campaigns intended for the benefit of local populations on the ground in the colonies. But the real focus of his address lies elsewhere, namely in the fact that American intervention in the tropics had moreover, and I quote him one last time here, promise, brought to the attention of the whole country the necessity for widespread reform in our provisions for the maintenance of health and the prevention of disease at home. And what Taft envisioned and what kinds of reforms were actually implemented in US public health over the next decade, and to what extent these reforms can be traced back to the colonial side of American medicine, is another issue for another paper, so I'll leave it at that for now, and that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.